Greetings! In this video we will introduce the terminal and the command line in Linux. As this is the first video in the Terminal Linux series, we will be conducting a high-level discussion about the terminal as a foundational building block for the rest of this series. This is going to be a fairly generic introduction for those new to Linux. While some might argue with some of the accuracy of some of the information presented, I felt it was necessary to present it in this manner to aid in the understanding of what in many instances is presented as a somewhat overly complex topic. And the terminal really isn't overly complex. My hope is to aid new users to Linux in understanding some of the key concepts related to some of the jargon and technical terms that are always thrown around and crop up when discussing the Linux terminal. While many who try Linux might argue for a better graphical user experience in Windows, there is little argument that Linux outperforms Windows at the command line. So let's get to it. Before jumping straight into talking about the terminal, let's discuss the Linux system architecture. A large part of the Linux architecture is not accessible directly by the user, well, at least a non-privileged user, and we will refer to this area as kernel land. And what the user, the non-privileged user, has access to is what we will refer to as user land. At the very bottom of our Linux architecture is the hardware, and this is firmly in kernel land. On top of that, the kernel sits. Now, that's an oversimplification. There's other stuff down there. There's drivers and other kernel mods and things, but basically the kernel sits on top of the hardware. And then on top of the kernel, we have a system interface, which is how the shell programs, which we will define later, talk to the system. So your first layer in user land is your shell. It's going to be either a text shell or a GUI or graphical user interface shell. On top of the shell, if it's a text shell, you have the console, which consists of basically an input-output device or keyboard input, display output, and that's about it. If you have a graphical user interface or GUI shell, you'll have a terminal emulator. We will use the terms terminal and terminal emulator interchangeably, but a terminal emulator is basically a program running under your GUI that emulates the console. Now, it's through your terminal or your console that you, the user, will communicate with the rest of the system and get things done. So this is a fairly important concept to get down before we move on. Let's talk about the shell specifically. So a shell is an interpreter interface for interaction between the system and the user. The shell can be either a graphical user interface, GUI, or plain text. Just a note, remember some of these acronyms: GUI, graphical user interface, also called GUI. So let's take a look at different shells real quick. You may not be aware of it, but there are actually, if you're using Windows, 3 shells. There's the Windows GUI, which is one shell, then you have the command shell, and then you have the PowerShell. So yeah, Windows has 3 shells that you can use. Linux has multiple shells also, way more than Windows, both GUI and text. Examples of a GUI shell are GNOME shell and KDE Plasma. They say the KDE desktop, but Plasma is the environment it runs in, or its shell, and GNOME, and it runs in the GNOME shell. Now, there's also a large number of text shells out there too. A couple of examples: the original Bourne shell. Well, I don't know if it's the original, but it's a very old shell that a lot of Unix and Linux users use. The Born Again shell, which is a more updated version of the Bash shell. There's something called the C shell or CSH, the Korn shell or Cron shell, Korn shell, KSH, then the Debian Almaquist shell or Dash. A large number of Linux distributions use the Bash shell as the default. Generally, the SH shell is included with pretty much every distribution as well for compatibility reasons. And I need to bring up the term POSIX, or Portable Operating System Interface, for this, POSIX. This is the IEEE standard 1003.1. The latest release was in 2024 and is the current version. This is a set of standards for interoperability between various operating systems, and most shells in Linux adhere to a subset of the POSIX standard. In addition to that, they have their own special additions and add-ons, if you will. And this is an example we'll get into later. If you're writing a bash script, for example, you want to try and use POSIX compatible commands in your script to ensure portability between different versions of shells and different Linux distributions. It's one thing you'll find out pretty quickly. Bash has a lot of nice shortcuts that aren't available in the SH shell, but if you use them, you will not be able to run your program under the Bourne shell. It'll have to run under Bourne again or Bash shell. And again, if these options aren't supported in C shell, the cron shell, or any other shell, then you won't be able to run your bash scripts there, which is why the POSIX standard exists. Okay, next is the console. The console is a basic input-output interface that the shell runs in. The console is strictly an interface to the shell that sits between user space and kernel space. That's the shell, not the console. In the absence of any other input-output, a computer will have a console consisting of an input device and an output device. Input device will usually be a keyboard of some sort, and the output device will usually be a display. For computers that only use consoles, you will unlikely have any mouse as an input or output device. Strictly your keyboard. Historically, consoles were things like teletypes and standalone terminals hooked to mainframe computers. Terminals basically had the intelligence needed to display characters on the screen and exchange messages via serial RS-232 with the mainframe computer, and that was about it. They were fairly simple devices. Software consoles on your computer are also fairly simple devices. I will say that today most Linux systems have multiple consoles available through your user interface. There will be one console position that's dedicated to your graphics user display, and then there will be multiple consoles dedicated to text. I'll do a quick example here. Arch Linux. Using a Control-Alt and a function key, those are the ones on your keyboard with the F1, F2, F3, etc. Anyway, using Control-Alt and a function key selects which console you're currently looking at. In Arch, the F2 key with the Control and the Alt key will bring up the graphics interface. If you use Control-Alt F3, F4, up F5, F6, these will all bring up various text interfaces. They'll be like TTY3, TTY4, TTY5, etc. This could be a very useful feature if one of your consoles, say the graphical user interface, freezes up. You can do Control-Alt function key and shift to a text console, log in, and either kill the process that's holding everything up or restart your computer. So consoles can be very handy, and they're actually not that difficult. They're actually easier than terminals because they are what they are, and that's it. Before we jump into the fun stuff, aka playing in the command line actually, let's talk about a final element here, terminals, or terminal emulators as they're sometimes referred to. I will be using the two terms interchangeably. A terminal or terminal emulator is a software-based device running within your GUI. It emulates the basic functions of your console, which again, consoles don't have a lot of basic functions, so there's not much to emulate. However, most terminals have a lot of other options available that you will not have on a console. There are many terminal emulators available in Linux. Again, Linux is about choice. Sometimes for some people, choice is a bad thing, but it's neither good nor bad, it just is. Xterm is an early example of a terminal emulator. It was is part of X11 and Xorg projects and has been around pretty much since they've been around, if not longer. It's fairly straightforward. Fairly simple, not as many features as other terminal emulators. However, it's a lot lighter and fairly quick and responsive. Console is a terminal emulator available in the KDE desktop environment. It's got a lot more features than Xterm, but then again, it's not quite as responsive as Xterm. GNOME terminal emulator is available in the GNOME desktop. Same comments as with console, it's also somewhat slower. There are other terminal emulators not tied to a specific desktop, like a Clarity, RxVT, and Terminator. One thing I want to point out here is I said like consoles tied to the KDE desktop, but there's nothing stopping you from using the console terminal emulator on a GNOME desktop or the GNOME terminal emulator on a KDE desktop. The only real downside to this is all the dependencies you're going to pull in for, KDE uses Qt dependencies, and GNOME uses GTK. And this is a bit technical, and I just want to point out that you can use pretty much any terminal emulator on any desktop. And I don't, this whole technical issue about dependencies is subject for another video, but just be aware you can do that. And a final note here on terminals, most of them have more features than you as a new user are ever going to use, are going to use as a new user. So as a beginner, it's not overly critical, doesn't really matter. Use whatever terminal emulator comes with your system. As you progress in Linux, and specifically with the command line, you might find some features in some terminal emulators you like and other features you don't like. And at this point, you can become a bit more choosy about which ones you use and which ones fit your workflow. But again, as a beginner, whatever terminal emulator comes with your system, it's just fine to use that. All right. Enough of the technical jargon and stuff. Let's have some fun. Let's get a terminal going. For this exercise, I'm going to be launching a virtual machine and running Linux Mint Debian Edition, and we'll do our work from in there. One of the reasons I want to do this is if I'm going to demonstrate shifting between various consoles, and you can't really do that on the distribution I'm recording on because when I shift consoles, you'll just see a black screen. So we're going to use a virtual machine to do this. The technique's a little different, but the results are basically the same. So once we've got the virtual machine running, the first thing we want to do, if you'll remember, we said Control, Alt, and Function key. Well, it's a little different with the virtual machine. You need to use the virtual machine's hotkey, which in this case is right Control plus your Function key. And if I do that here, we can see we shifted to a text console. This is TTY4. It's kind of small and hard to read. Again, one of the issues with using a console, I actually have to log in and change fonts to make this a little more readable. And then we can do 3 and 2 and 6. And if we do host key F7, we end up back at the GUI. So again, as I said, lots of things you can do with this. For example, if your GUI freezes up, you can move over to a console and you can try killing the process that's taking up all your processor time, or you can just restart your machine. So those are some positive nits from being able to switch to a console-only mode. Now that we're back in the GUI, let's go look for the terminal. And as you can see, we've got one right here in the shortcut bar. This is a shortcut to the terminal. We have another shortcut in the quick launch bar on our menu bar. In Cinnamon, or in Linux Mint Debian Edition, the terminal actually resides under administration. We could also use the search bar at the top just to type terminal. Let's go ahead and launch the terminal and go to full screen. And let's increase the size of the font a little to make it a bit more visible. I hope that's better. Let's start with something simple like terminal, unlike a console, has menus. We can go to the help menu, about, and we can see that Linux Mint Debian Edition with the Cinnamon desktop is using the GNOME terminal. Okay. Remember I said you can use whatever terminal with whatever desktop you want. It's just a lot of dependency issues you could run into, but here's a prime example. Let's try something simple. We're going to do a echo command. And we're going to use a shell variable or a terminal variable. We preface that with a $sign. This is $shell in capital letters. When we hit return, it tells us we are in /bin/bash, which tells us we are using the bash shell here. So that's probably the easiest way to identify what shell you're using. So basically the way it works is you have your command, echo in this case. You have options. We didn't use any options with echo. And then you have your argument, which was the $shell variable. That was our argument. Some commands don't need arguments. They don't need options. It just depends. For example, this is list with the -al option. That's ls-al, and that shows us everything in our home directory. Let's do list with just the -l option. That only shows us visible files. Any file starting with a dot in Linux is invisible unless you use something like the -a option to show it. You will notice we don't have an argument here either. I mean, we could put an argument with the directory we wanted to look at, but in this case, it's optional. You don't need it. If you don't put an argument in, it uses default values. Incidentally, for your Windows terminal users, if you type dir, you get the directory list. Next thing I want to talk about is man pages. The command man accesses a database on your system with pages for most commands with some basic information about how to use them. I like their example. He'll try man, which is the entry for the man command. But let's do man echo. You can see his name, synopsis, description, and you've got some options. You got short options and long options and various escape sequences. And if you want to search this man page, you can use the / in your search term. I did -E so we can see where they all show up. Make it easy to find stuff. And then Q to quit. Now, let's try this. Echo --version. And you notice we got exactly what we typed. It echoed it right back to the screen. So our argument was, this was read as an argument and not as an option. There's a reason for that. There are basically 2 echo commands in your system. One is called a built-in command because it's part of the shell. The other one is just a command. It's a binary file on your computer. So let's type another command here. We'll visit this one later. I just want to demonstrate compgen -b. And this lists all our built-in shell commands here. And we can scroll through them and we can find echo. And if we do an ls, and we're going to give an argument here, the directory bin, and we scroll through these files, we can also find the echo command. Now that's a lot of scrolling, you might say. There's an easier way to do this, so we're going to introduce another command here. And a new concept called piping. So if we go back to our compgen -b, we do a pipe bar, which is on the right-hand side of your keyboard above the /, and then the command grep and echo. And what grep does is it searches the output of comp. We've basically piped or sent the output of compgen -b to grep, and grep searches for any line with the word echo in it and prints that back to us. So we get echo, and that tells us it's in here, so it's a built-in command. Now if we do ls bin, again, grep echo, we can see there's a couple of echo commands in there, but we do specifically see echo as a binary file. So if we want to actually run the binary file, we need to call it directly, so we'll use its folder location, and we're going to cover that a lot more in the follow-up video about Linux file structure, but it's /bin /echo --version, and this time version is read as an option, and we get the version number, 9.1 in this case. Okay, homework for the next video. Let's go in and read the man pages for ls, grep, and echo. Get you used to using the man pages. I mean, okay, technically you could open up a browser if you're running in a window and you could look up the same information, but it's just a lot quicker here. If you're using consoles, you could have a second console where you could look up the man page information and shift back and forth, or you could have a second window or a tab on a browser that supports tabs doing the same thing. But anyway, homework assignment is go ahead and use man pages and get used to using that, because that is your friend when you're using the terminal. Okay. Okay, that was my introduction to using the Linux terminal, command line, shell, console, whichever term you want to use. This is going to be the first in several videos covering this particular subject. If you're interested, stay tuned for more videos. Again, I'm going to try and keep this really simple at a fairly low level. I'm hoping to encourage more new users to spend some time in the console. As always, if you find this video useful, if you like this video, please like, please subscribe, and please comment. And if there's any specific shell aspects or terminal aspects you want discussed in the future, please let me know so I can cover them. In another week, I'll be dropping another video with some more simplified terminal information for new users of Linux. So I'll see you then.